Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we're pulling back the curtain on a forgotten chapter of Tudor history, one that takes us into the gilded nursery of a prince, and later the dark, damp halls of a dying king. We're going to witness the arrival of a boy who was supposed to be the perfect heir, the one who would secure a dynasty, but who instead became the tragic linchpin of a nightmare. You're going to see how the highest echelons of power can protect you from nothing, and how even a royal birth can be the first step on a journey to a gruesome end. You probably won't survive this, but in the best way possible. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and what time it is for you in the comments, so we can all feel a little less alone in this dark. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture it, if you will. You're shivering in the pre-dawn chill of an October morning in 1537. The air in London is thick with the smell of wood smoke and wet wool, and the silence is a heavy, expectant thing. For years, this kingdom has been holding its breath, waiting for a single, perfect sound. The sound of a newborn cry, the sound of a son. You see, for over 2 decades, the great King Henry VIII, that colossus of a man whose appetites were as vast as his ego, had been trying to sire a male heir. His first marriage, to Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter, Mary, but no son. His second, to the ill-fated Anne Boleyn, had also produced a daughter, Elizabeth, and a swift trip to the block. But now, with his third wife, Jane Seymour, locked away in Hampton Court Palace, the kingdom's collective anxiety was reaching a fever pitch. There were whispers of curses, of a king so cursed he could only produce girls, and of a future where his legacy would crumble. And then, on a Friday morning, the silence breaks. Not with one cry, but with a symphony of bells ringing out across London. St. Paul's Cathedral peals, then the smaller parish churches join in, a joyous, cacophonous announcement that shakes the very foundations of the city. A gun salute from the Tower of London booms across the Thames, a series of booming affirmations. It's a boy, a prince, a son. You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief that sweeps through the country. It's a moment of unparalleled joy, a release of all that pent-up tension. Henry VIII himself, a man who'd gone through 2 wives and torn his entire kingdom away from the Catholic Church just for this moment, is beside himself. He's already 46 years old, his body a battlefield of old jousting wounds and gout, but this news seems to rejuvenate him. He's said to have wept with joy and to have held his infant son, his perfect tiny son, up to the light, as if to show him off to the entire world. This child, born at long last, is christened Edward. He is born to a king who had quite literally moved heaven and earth to get him, and a kingdom that was desperate for him. From the very moment of his birth, he is not just a baby, he is a symbol. He is the future, the dynasty. He is everything. The celebrations that follow are lavish beyond belief. A bonfire burns for a week outside the Royal Exchange, a giant beacon of relief and good fortune. The streets are decorated with streamers and flowers, and the taverns are full of people drinking free beer, courtesy of the king's coffers. The air is electric, with a sense of security and promise that had been missing for years. For the first time in a very long time, it feels like everything is going to be all right. But as you bask in the glow of this perfect moment, you have to remember that you're living in a world where nothing is ever truly perfect. You can hear the faint, distant coughs coming from the other side of the palace, a quiet, almost imperceptible detail that whispers of a tragedy to come. Jane Seymour, the queen who finally gave Henry his son, is succumbing to a postpartum infection. The same man who held his son up to the heavens would, just 12 days later, be a widower again, watching as his queen was laid to rest. The king's immense joy is already tainted with a profound sadness. This sets a tone for Edward's entire life. He will be a boy born to immense joy and even more immense tragedy. He will be raised on the kind of love and attention most of us can only dream of, but it will be a suffocating kind of love, a love that expects him to be a perfect vessel for a kingdom's hopes. Historians still argue whether Jane Seymour's death was a genuine, unbearable grief for Henry, or simply a terrible inconvenience that spoiled the joy of his son's birth. We can't know for sure, but we do know that the memory of his mother's death would cast a long, lonely shadow over the rest of Edward's childhood. You, standing here in the smoky, celebratory streets of London, feel a sense of hope that is almost intoxicating. But you also know the deeper truth. A boy has been born, and he is a miracle. But he is also a boy. He is flesh and blood. And in an age of plague, of disease, of political intrigue, being a miracle is a very dangerous thing indeed. You can see the dark undertones even in the brightest moments. It's a mainstream historical fact that Edward the Rig was the only legitimate son of Henry VIII to survive infancy. A quirky tidbit in itself in an age where infant mortality was rampant. But you, watching from the sidelines, can already sense that his survival might be less of a blessing and more of a prelude to a story that's anything but a fairy tale. Welcome back. You're still standing in that celebratory London street, the echoes of the bells and the cheers still ringing in your ears, but as the day turns to night and the bonfires start to die down, you can feel a shift in the mood. The overwhelming joy of Edward's birth is now tempered by a quiet, gnawing anxiety that every person in the kingdom feels in their bones. This isn't a modern anxiety about money or work. This is the primal, ever-present fear of losing a child. A fear you understand instinctively in this time and place. You see, in the 16th century, life was brutally short and mercilessly fragile. Infant mortality was not a tragic exception. It was a grim expectation. Historians still argue whether the numbers were as high as some estimates. But the fact remains, 1 in 5 children born in Tudor England would not live to see their first birthday, and a staggering half of all children would not reach adulthood. This isn't a fun fact to drop at a cocktail party, but it's a vital piece of context for Edward's story. He wasn't just a royal baby, he was a medical longshot, a precious, and therefore terrifyingly vulnerable lottery ticket. And so, as you walk past the palace walls, you can feel the collective breath being held. Every cough from Edward's chambers, every fever, every little bout of colic, it's all magnified 1,000 times over. It's a constant, low-level hum of dread. It's not just a baby sleeping in there, it's the future of the kingdom. And that future is terrifyingly, heartbreakingly fragile. The king himself, Henry VIII, is acutely aware of this. His immense joy at Edward's birth is shadowed by his prior, painful losses. Remember how many children he'd had, or tried to have. Several stillbirths with Catherine of Aragon, a short-lived son with her who died in infancy. And of course, his son Anne Boleyn miscarried, which sealed her doom. He knows better than anyone that a son born is not a son who will live. And so Edward's childhood becomes a paradox of immense adoration and suffocating fear. He's a child wrapped in silk and swaddled in paranoia. His nursery, for example, is not just a room, it's a fortress against the world. No one, not even the king, can enter without first being meticulously cleaned and disinfected. You can almost smell the overpowering scent of rosewater and herbs meant to ward off disease. There are guards at the door, but not just to prevent kidnapping. They are there to make sure no one with a cough or a sneeze gets within 20 feet of the royal heir. Every person who handles him, from the nurses to the nannies, is handpicked for their robust health and their impeccable lineage. It's a level of obsessive hygiene that would make a modern-day germaphobe blush. The food Edward eats is tasted by a taster first, not just for poison, which is a constant fear, but also to ensure it's not spoiled. His clothes are laundered with special soaps. His bedding is changed daily. He lives in a bubble, a pristine, almost sterile environment in a world that is, by our standards, filthy. The irony of this is almost comical. The very measures taken to protect him might also be the very things that make him more susceptible to later illness. His immune system, never exposed to the normal germs of life, might not have had the chance to develop as it should have. You, observing this from the outside, might think it's all a bit much, a bit silly even. But in this era, it's not silly. It's a desperate, scientific-ish attempt to defy the Grim Reaper. They don't know about viruses or bacteria, but they do know that people get sick, and they have vague, superstitious ideas about how to prevent it. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen we talked about in another story? This is the same kind of logic. A mix of genuine care, misguided science, and sheer, terrified desperation. The king's anxiety bleeds into every aspect of Edward's life. He's not allowed to run and play like a normal boy. He's not allowed to get dirty. He's often kept indoors in the quiet, protected atmosphere of the nursery, isolated from his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who are, to the king's eyes, less valuable and therefore less in need of such paranoid protection. It's a strange, lonely kind of existence for a child. He has everyone in the kingdom doting on him, but he has no one. This is a quirky or fringe tidbit of history. While we know Henry was an overbearing father, the sheer scale of the anti-infant mortality measures taken for Edward were truly unprecedented. Historians still argue whether this obsessive overprotection was the reason for his delicate health later in life, or whether he was just naturally fragile. But what's certain is that it laid the groundwork for his entire existence. He was a boy defined by what people were trying to protect him from, not by what they were encouraging him to be. As you stand outside the palace, watching the king's men move in and out, you can see the constant motion, the frantic energy, the unspoken fear. The kingdom has a son, but they don't know if they will get to keep him. You can feel the weight of this uncertainty in the air, a constant pressure that will shape every decision and every event for the next decade. The shadow of infant mortality, a thing that was a tragic constant for every family in Tudor England, becomes, for Edward, the central fact of his early life. It's a shadow that follows him from the crib all the way to a cold, lonely deathbed that is still decades away, and yet feels, even now, terrifyingly close. You've moved a little closer to the palace walls now, the celebratory bonfires a memory, and the chilling reality of the Tudor court beginning to set in. You see King Henry VIII, no longer the boisterous young man who tore through France and jousts, but a heavy, lumbering monarch, his face flushed and his brow permanently furrowed. He is a man consumed by one thing, and one thing only, his son Edward. His obsession is a spectacle to behold. It eclipses everything. The court, once a bustling hive of political intrigue and diplomacy, now seems to revolve around the nursery. You'll see the king himself on his good days, trundling down the long corridors, his heavy breathing a prelude to his arrival, just to catch a glimpse of the sleeping child. He demands constant updates on the boy's weight, his bowel movements, the exact time of his naps. This is not the stuff of statecraft. This is the stuff of a father completely and utterly fixated on his legacy. A mainstream historical fact is that Henry doted on Edward to an almost unhealthy degree, writing to his ambassadors that the prince is in the best health and daily grows stronger. Every sneeze, every smile, every milestone is reported on and celebrated. This obsession comes at a steep price, though. Remember his two daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. You might catch a glimpse of them from time to time, walking the grounds with their ladies-in-waiting, looking like a forgotten footnote in their father's life. To Henry, they are an embarrassment, a reminder of his failed marriages, and now, with the arrival of Edward, they are practically non-existent. Mary, his eldest, who had been his beloved daughter and even his designated heir before the divorce from Catherine of Aragon, is now little more than a pawn in a political game. She is forced to acknowledge the illegitimacy of her own birth and is often kept away from court. Elizabeth, the daughter of the disgraced Anne Boleyn, is in a similar boat, a child born of sin in her father's eyes. They are ghosts in their own home, pushed aside to make room for the one thing Henry truly cares about. The king's world shrinks to the size of a cradle. You can hear his voice booming from his chambers, not about foreign policy or the state of the treasury, but about the quality of the wool in Edward's blankets. He commissions painters to create grand portraits of his son, a chubby, placid infant with an almost unnerving stillness in his eyes. These portraits aren't just art, they are propaganda. They are meant to show the world that the Tudor line is secure, that Henry has triumphed over his wives and his rivals, and that his legacy will continue. His obsession has a ripple effect on the entire court. Ambitious courtiers, sensing the shift in the royal wind, begin to jockey for position around the prince. They don't vie for the king's ear anymore, they vie for the chance to be near the boy. To be a part of his household is to be at the centre of power. Men like Edward Seymour, the boy's uncle, and later John Dudley, begin to see their futures not in service to the ageing king, but in service to the vulnerable, impressionable prince. They shower him with gifts, whisper sweet nothings in his ear, and begin the long, slow process of influencing the child, who will one day hold the kingdom in his hands. It's a game of long-term chess, and the child is the king piece. There's a subtle, almost humorous absurdity to it all. One might imagine a great king, a master of strategy, a lion of a man being brought to his knees by a tiny, gurgling infant. But that is exactly what happens. Henry, the man who defied the Pope and executed his closest friends, is utterly dominated by his paternal need to protect this one precious thing. He had sacrificed so much to have him, a marriage, a queen, his standing with the Catholic Church, that the boy's existence became his sole purpose. This is a quirky tidbit of Tudor life, the king's emotional state becoming a literal barometer for the entire court's behaviour. The king's mood swings, from elation when the prince coos to despair when he has a sniffle, dictate the fortunes of the realm. This fixation also had a scholarly debate attached to it. Historians still argue whether Henry's obsession was out of genuine, deep-seated love, or simply a cold, calculated need for a male heir to secure his dynasty. Was it the love of a father for his son, or the love of a king for his legacy? You can watch him as he stands over the crib, and you can see a bit of both. You see the tired, worn-out face of a man who just wants to see his family name continue. But you also see the unblinking, single-minded focus of a monarch who knows that without this child, everything he has worked for will fall apart. As you turn to leave the court for a moment, you feel the weight of this obsession. It's heavy, and it's suffocating. It's a gilded cage, not just for the king, but for the prince. A child born with everything, but who is, in a very real way, a prisoner of his own importance. He is not a boy. He is a symbol, a vessel for a kingdom's hopes, a king's dreams, and the ruthless ambition of those around him. And as you walk away, you have a feeling that this gilded cage will be the first step on a journey that will end in a place far from the light and joy of the palace nursery. You're back now, but the world has subtly, yet irrevocably changed. The nursery is no longer the centre of the universe. King Henry VIII is still on the throne, but his health is failing, his body a ruin of jousting injuries, gout, and immense weight. His moods are more volatile than ever, and his court is a high-stakes chess game played for his favour. And in the middle of it all, a small boy named Edward is growing up. He is no longer an infant. He is a prince, a child of immense promise and suffocating expectation, a boy who is navigating a boyhood more precarious than any other. Imagine Edward now, not as the placid infant from the portraits, but as a small, frail boy with a thin face and intelligent, piercing eyes. He has an unquenchable thirst for knowledge and a serious, almost preternaturally sober demeanour. He is taught by a series of brilliant tutors, men who are handpicked not just for their academic prowess, but for their religious fervour. His education is comprehensive and demanding. He learns Latin and Greek by the age of 7, and later French, Spanish and Italian. He is a prodigy, a child who seems to absorb knowledge like a sponge, devouring texts on history, geography and theology. He is by all accounts an extraordinarily bright child. But his childhood is also one of immense loneliness. He's kept isolated from his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who are only occasionally allowed to see him. He does not have friends his own age. His companions are his tutors and his royal household, all of whom treat him with a reverence that borders on deification. There are no boisterous games of hide-and-seek, no rough-and-tumble play. His recreation is intellectual, chess, music, and scholarly pursuits. He's a boy in a man's world, and a lonely one at that. This loneliness is compounded by the immense religious and political upheaval that swirls around him. His father's break with the Catholic Church has plunged the kingdom into a state of religious flux. The old ways, the lavish ceremonies, the veneration of saints, the power of the Pope are being torn down and replaced with something new, and to many terrifying. The Protestant Reformation, a tidal wave of religious change that had been sweeping across Europe, is now crashing down on England. And Edward, raised by devoutly Protestant tutors and surrounded by men who believe in this new, purer faith, is being trained to be its champion. You can almost feel the tension in the air. The old guard, the conservatives who cling to the Catholic traditions, watch the prince's education with suspicion. They see a boy being moulded into a radical. They see a future where the venerated saints are cast down, the monasteries are dissolved, and the very fabric of their society is changed. They look at Edward, this sickly, studious boy, and they don't see a king. They see a wrecking ball. This is a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI was raised as a devout Protestant from a young age, a stark contrast to his father's often schizophrenic religious policy, which had veered between Catholic and Protestant ideals depending on his political needs. Edward's childhood faith was deep, unshakable, and absolute. There's a quirky tidbit to this, though. At one point, when Henry was in one of his more conservative moods, he sent a stern letter to Edward's tutors, demanding they ease off on the zealous Protestant instruction. He reportedly told them to teach the boy in the old fashion, meaning with a more Catholic leaning. This request, however, was quietly ignored. The tutors and the powerful men around the prince like Edward Seymour knew that Henry was on his way out, and that the future of the kingdom belonged to the new faith. They gambled on it, and you can almost imagine them exchanging wry, knowing glances as they wrote their placating letters back to the ailing king, all while continuing to indoctrinate his son into the new religion. This highlights an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward's intense religious faith was a genuine personal conviction, or if it was simply a product of the relentless, systematic indoctrination by the men who raised him. Was he truly a zealous Protestant, or just a boy who absorbed the beliefs of the only people who ever paid attention to him? You can watch him, a small figure hunched over a Latin text on theology, and you see a bit of both. You see a child who's been taught to believe in a certain way, but you also see an intellect so sharp and a mind so singular that you can't help but feel that his faith was, in the end, very much his own. He is a child of his time, and yet he is completely isolated from it. He is a king in waiting, and yet he is a pawn in a game played by older, more ruthless men. You can feel the weight of this on his small shoulders. He doesn't get to be a boy. He has to be a king. He has to be a symbol. And as he trudges from one lesson to the next, from one prayer to the next, you can see the shadow of the man he will become, a man of unyielding faith and unyielding purpose, a man who will have to navigate a world that is not ready for him, and which will, in the end, swallow him whole. You've moved closer to the heart of the palace now, past the quiet, book-lined chambers where Edward spends his days, and into the grand halls and galleries where the real game is being played. The court of Henry VIII is no longer a place of grand tournaments and lavish banquets. It's a snake pit, a treacherous and unforgiving environment where fortunes are made and lost on the whims of a dying king. And for Edward, this is not just his home, it's his dangerous playground. He is, for all intents and purposes, the most valuable prize in the kingdom. Every courtier, every nobleman, every ambitious scoundrel sees him as the key to their future. They don't see a child, they see a puppet, an instrument of power waiting to be controlled. His education is not just about learning, it's about manipulation. His tutors, like the brilliant humanist Roger Ascham, are genuinely trying to shape a good king, but others, like his uncle Edward Seymour, are using their influence to subtly push their own agendas. It's a delicate and ruthless dance. You see Seymour, a tall, ambitious man with a cold glint in his eye, spending hours with his nephew. He doesn't talk about Latin grammar or Greek philosophy. He talks about power. He talks about the need for a strong Protestant leader to guide the kingdom away from the superstitions of the past. He praises Edward's intelligence and his piety, subtly stroking the boy's ego and reinforcing the idea that he is not just a future king, but a divinely appointed one. It's a masterclass in political grooming, a kind of psychological warfare waged on a child. And Edward, for his part, is not an idiot. He is a child, yes, but he is a deeply intelligent and observant one. He sees the jockeying for position, the false smiles, the whispered conversations that stop when he enters a room. He is learning, not just from books, but from watching. He is learning about the fragility of loyalty and the brutality of ambition. He's learning that the men who dote on him now would turn on him in a heartbeat if it meant more power for themselves. A quirky tidbit about this time is that Edward was an avid diary keeper, and his journals from this period are filled with sharp, almost cynical observations about the political games being played around him. He's a child who sees the adults for exactly what they are, hungry predators circling a vulnerable prey. This is a mainstream historical fact. The latter years of Henry VIII's reign were marked by intense factionalism, with the conservative Catholics faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk and Bishop Stephen Gardiner, and the Protestant faction, led by Edward Seymour and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, constantly vying for control of the prince and the future of the kingdom. The court was a hotbed of spies, informers and backstabbing, a very dangerous place for a boy to be raised. This is where the open scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether Edward's rigid, unwavering Protestantism was an act of genuine faith or a calculated embrace of the faction that was winning. Did he truly believe in the tenets of the new religion, Or did he simply align himself with the powerful men who were grooming him for the throne? You can look at his sharp, precocious letters to his tutors and his father, and you can see a hint of both. You see a child who is genuinely intellectually curious about theology, but you also see a boy who knows which side his bread is buttered on. You'll see a small, almost comical moment that shows the absurdity of this. One day, a conservative nobleman brings Edward a beautiful, illuminated Catholic prayer book as a gift. Edward, a boy who has been taught that such things are relics of a bygone superstitious age, takes the book, smiles politely, and then proceeds to take a knife and meticulously scrape out the images of the saints and the Virgin Mary, declaring them to be idolatrous. He then presents the defaced book back to the stunned nobleman. It's a chilling moment, a perfect blend of childhood petulance and ruthless conviction. It's a small act of defiance, but it's a message to everyone at court. This boy is not a pawn. He is already a player, and his beliefs are not up for negotiation. The court is a dangerous playground, and Edward, for all his fragility, is learning how to play the game. He's learning the rules, and he's learning how to break them. He is surrounded by people who claim to love him, who claim to have his best interests at heart. But he knows, in a deep and profound way, that he is alone. He is the sun around which all the planets revolve, but he is also a lonely, solitary figure in a vast, empty solar system. And as you watch him, a small, pale boy navigating this brutal adult world, you can't help but feel a chilling sense of dread. The boy is learning the game, but the game is not designed for a child. It's designed to break him, to use him, and to, in the end, discard him when he's no longer useful. You've watched Edward grow from a sickly infant to a solemn, studious boy, a pawn in a treacherous game. But now the game is drawing to a close. The final years of King Henry VIII's reign are a twilight of decay and paranoia. The once mighty monarch, bloated and festering with old wounds, is a shell of his former self. He is more unpredictable than ever, his temper flaring at the slightest provocation, and his court lives in a constant state of terror. And in the midst of this terrifying decline, Edward's lonely rise to power begins in earnest. The king's declining health is a public secret. Everyone knows he's dying, even if no one dares to say it out loud. The court becomes a morbid waiting room. You can almost feel the hushed anticipation, the quiet jockeying for position as the vultures circle the dying lion. The Protestant faction, led by Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, is gaining ground. They have the prince, and they have his ear. They see a future where their radical new faith will sweep away the old traditions and establish a new world order. The conservative Catholic faction is in a state of quiet despair, their power waning with every wheezing breath from the king. They know that once Edward is on the throne, their time is over. Edward himself is now a teenager, a boy of 9 or 10 who is being relentlessly prepared for a throne he doesn't yet sit on. His education intensifies. He's no longer just learning from books, he's learning from practice. He's present at council meetings, not as a participant, but as a silent observer. He watches as his father's ministers debate policy, as ambassadors from foreign lands present their cases, and as men are condemned to death. He's being taught to be a king, but the lessons are harsh and unforgiving. He is learning, as all good kings must, to be ruthless. There's a mainstream historical fact that is often overlooked in the grand narrative of Henry VIII's reign. In his final months, the king, in a fit of paranoia, ordered the arrest of the powerful Duke of Norfolk and his son, the Earl of Surrey, the leaders of the Catholic faction. Surrey was executed, and Norfolk was saved from the block only by the king's death, which came the very next day. This ruthless act of self-preservation, this final political purge, left the Protestant faction, led by Edward Seymour, in complete control. It was a parting gift from the dying king to his son, a kingdom free of his most powerful rivals. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. During this time, Edward's tutors and advisors started to deliberately isolate him from his father's influence. They would often tell Henry that the boy was too ill to travel, or too busy with his studies to visit the king's sickbed. This was a polite fiction, a way of ensuring that Henry's volatile moods and unpredictable decisions would not derail their plans for the future. You can almost imagine the relief they must have felt when a messenger came with the news that the king was too ill to receive visitors. They weren't just protecting the prince's health, they were protecting their own power. This period also brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward was aware of the political machinations taking place around him, and if he gave his tacit approval to the actions of his Protestant allies. Was he a naive child, a tool in the hands of his ambitious uncle? Or was he a willing participant, a boy who was already in his own mind a zealous religious reformer, ready to embrace the radical changes his father had only flirted with? You can look at his letters and his journal entries from this time, and you can see a strange blend of childlike innocence and a cold, almost detached understanding of power. He writes about his studies, his prayers, and the mundane details of his day, but he also writes about the men around him, their ambitions and their loyalties, with a clarity that is unnerving for a boy his age. The final days are a blur. You hear the news, whispers at first, then a public announcement. King Henry VIII is dead. He died on January 28, 1547. For 3 days his death is kept a secret, a political necessity to ensure a smooth transition of power. You can feel the tension in the city, a quiet, almost unbearable suspense. And then the news is announced. The bells ring, but this time it's not a sound of pure joy. It's a sound of relief, of fear, and of immense, terrible change. Edward is now king. He's only 9 years old. He's a boy who has lived his life in a gilded cage, protected from the world but also from the messy, complicated realities of it. He's a boy who's about to take on the most powerful title in the kingdom, but who has no real power of his own. He is a king in name, but a prisoner of his own youth and his own convictions. And as you watch him, a small solitary figure being led to the throne, you can't help but feel a deep and profound sense of foreboding. The boy's lonely rise to power is complete, but the real story, the one that will end in a death more horrific than you've been told, is just beginning. You've watched the solemn procession, the quiet, sombre journey of a small boy from his lessons to the throne. The air is thick with anticipation and unease. The city is still, waiting to see what this new era will bring. A 9-year-old is now the King of England, a boy who has lived his entire life in the shadow of his father's greatness and the paranoia of his court. This is not the grand coronation you might expect, filled with triumph and pageantry. It's a quiet, almost unsettling beginning to a short and tragic reign. Edward is crowned at Westminster Abbey on February 20th, 1547. He's a tiny figure swallowed by the heavy robes of state, his face pale and serious. He doesn't look like a king, he looks like a child playing dress-up. But as he sits on the ancient coronation chair, the symbol of his power, you can see something in his eyes. It's not fear or awe or even a child's delight. It's a deep, unblinking conviction. He believes in this. He believes in his role, in his destiny, and in his God. This is a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI was the first Protestant monarch to be crowned in England. His coronation was a meticulously planned affair, designed not just to legitimise his rule, but to announce a new religious era. The traditional Catholic ceremony was altered, with Protestant sermons and new prayers. The boy king was not just assuming a throne, he was assuming the mantle of a religious reformer. But of course, a 9-year-old boy can't rule a kingdom on his own. He is a symbol, a figurehead. The real power rests in the hands of the men who surround him. His uncle, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, is immediately named Lord Protector. He is the de facto ruler of the kingdom, a man who has now achieved the power he has spent years manoeuvring for. And he rules in Edward's name, but for his own ends. The court is now his dangerous playground, and he is the king of it. You can almost feel the power shift. The conservative faction, the Catholics who had hoped for a different outcome, are now powerless. Bishop Stephen Gardiner, a formidable force under Henry VIII, is immediately thrown in the Tower. The Catholic symbols of power are stripped away. The monasteries, which had been dissolved by Henry, are now officially and irrevocably gone. The Reformation, which had been a slow, often reluctant process under the old king, now accelerates at a breakneck pace. Edward, for his part, is not a passive figure in this. He is a boy, but he is a boy with a fierce and unyielding sense of purpose. He is a zealous Protestant, and he takes his role as the head of the church very, very seriously. He attends council meetings, he reads the theological treatises, and he signs off on the radical changes that are being enacted in his name. You can see his small, spidery signature on documents that strip the altars of their gilded ornaments, that abolish Catholic rituals, and that order the destruction of statues and religious artefacts. He's not just a figurehead. He's an accomplice, a willing participant in the destruction of the old world. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. Edward, a boy who grew up isolated and starved for companionship, was said to have a pet monkey. This monkey, a small, mischievous creature, was his constant companion, often seen climbing on the throne during official receptions. It's a small, almost comical detail that reminds you that for all his power and his conviction, Edward was still just a child. He was a king with a monkey on his shoulder, a juxtaposition that is both charming and profoundly sad. This is where the open scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether Edward's intense involvement in the religious reforms was a result of his own deep conviction, or if he was simply a puppet, being manipulated by his uncle and the other Protestant leaders. Was he a child prodigy with an unshakable faith, or a boy who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that he believed the beliefs of the men around him were his own? You can watch him, a small pale figure, signing off on documents that would change the course of English history, and you can see a bit of both. You see a boy who has been groomed for this role, who has been taught to believe in a certain way, but you also see a glint of steel in his eye, a sense of purpose and conviction that feels utterly his own. The boy king has assumed his crown, but the real story, the one that will end in a death more horrific than you've been told, is just beginning. The kingdom is now his, but the power is in the hands of others. The boy who was so protected from the world is now at the centre of it, a storm of religious fervour and political ambition swirling around him, and as you stand there, watching the solemn procession, you can't shake the feeling that this reign will be a short one. The king is a child, and the kingdom is a beast that feeds on children. You've seen the boy king on his throne, a small figure of immense importance and zero real power. The sceptre he holds is a prop, the crown on his head is a symbol. The true power is now held by the men who raised him, the men who manoeuvred and schemed to get here. You can almost feel their collective sigh of relief, the moment of triumph that washes over the Protestant faction now that their boy is on the throne. They are the men who truly rule England now, and their rule is ruthless and absolute. At the head of this new government is Edward's uncle, Edward Seymour, now the Duke of Somerset and the Lord Protector. He is a tall, imposing man, but his ambition is even more imposing. He has been given the reins of the kingdom, and he intends to rule with a rod of iron. He is, to be fair, a true believer in the new faith. He sees his role as not just a political one, but a holy one, a mission to cleanse England of its Catholic superstitions and bring it into a new era of godly rule. But his actions are often more self-serving than pious. He builds a magnificent new palace, Somerset House, on the site of a demolished church, a symbolic act that showcases his power and his contempt for the old religion. He is a man who preaches humility, but lives in a state of immense, almost obscene, opulence. But Seymour is not alone. He has a council of men who are just as ambitious and just as ruthless as he is. There's Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, a quiet, scholarly man who has been a Protestant reformer for decades and who now has the chance to truly reshape the English Church. There's John Dudley, Viscount Lisle, and later the Duke of Northumberland, a man who is as brilliant as he is ambitious. He's a master of political manoeuvring, a man who knows how to wait for his moment and how to seize it with both hands. He's a man who sees Seymour's power as temporary, and he is biding his time, waiting for the right moment to strike. This is a mainstream historical fact. The early years of Edward's reign were dominated by the rivalry between these two men, the Lord Protector Seymour and the ambitious Dudley. It was a power struggle that would shape the rest of the reign, and ultimately seal the king's fate. Edward, for his part, is not an idiot. He sees what's happening. He is a boy, yes, but he is a deeply intelligent and observant one. He watches the council meetings, he reads the reports from the ambassadors, and he sees the shifting loyalties and the simmering rivalries. He knows, in his heart of hearts, that these men who claim to be serving him are serving themselves first. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. Edward, in his journal, wrote a cryptic entry about his uncle Seymour, stating that he was too proud for his own good. It's a chillingly prophetic statement from a boy who sees his uncle's immense pride and knows it will lead to his downfall. The political turmoil is constant. There are rebellions across the country from those who are resentful of the religious changes. There are wars with Scotland and France. The kingdom is a powder keg, and the men who are ruling it are more interested in their own power than they are in the stability of the realm. Seymour, in a fit of pride and arrogance, overreaches, He alienates the nobility, he mismanages the economy, and he loses the support of his one-time allies. He is, in the end, brought down by the very men he sought to control. John Dudley, the brilliant, ruthless manipulator, strikes at the perfect moment. He leads a coalition of nobles to overthrow Seymour. Seymour is arrested and sent to the Tower. He is tried for treason and executed. Edward, a boy who has lived his life under the shadow of his uncle's power, is now free of him. But he is not free. He has simply exchanged one master for another. Dudley is now the man in charge, and he is even more ruthless and even more ambitious than Seymour ever was. This is where the open scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether Edward was an active participant in his uncle's downfall, or if he was simply a frightened boy who was forced to sign off on the execution of the only real family he had left. Was he a child who was manipulated into betraying his own flesh and blood? Or was he a young man who saw his uncle's incompetence and believed that the kingdom would be better off without him? You can watch him, a small, pale figure, signing the death warrant for the man who had been his protector, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who has been taught to be a king, to make the hard choices, but you also see a child who has just lost the only man who truly cared for him, in his own way. The men who ruled behind him are gone, but the game is not over. Dudley, now in control, will prove to be an even more dangerous master. He will solidify his power, he will continue the ruthless religious reforms, and he will use Edward, his boy king, as a tool to cement his own legacy. And as you stand there, watching the new king's reign begin, you know that the boy is now a man, but he is a man whose strings are being pulled by a puppet master who will do anything to keep his grip on power. And the boy is about to learn that being a king doesn't mean you have power. It just means you have a target on your back. You've witnessed the brutal power struggle, the changing of the guard, and the quiet, almost unsettling rise of a new master. The Lord Protector Edward Seymour is gone, his head on a pike, and in his place stands John Dudley, now the Duke of Northumberland, a man with an ambition so vast it could swallow the kingdom whole. He is the new puppet master, and his puppet, the young King Edward VI, is a willing accomplice in the most radical and ruthless religious reforms England has ever seen. The first thing you'll notice is the shift in the air. Under Seymour, the Reformation was a gradual, almost reluctant process. Under Dudley, it's a full-throttle sprint. The altars are ripped out of the churches and replaced with plain wooden communion tables. The gilded chalices and jewelled crucifixes, relics of the old faith, are confiscated and melted down. The stained glass windows, once a riot of colour and story, are smashed and replaced with clear glass. The beautiful depictions of saints and biblical figures now considered idolatrous. You can almost hear the tinkling of shattered glass, the silent screams of 1,000 years of tradition being wiped away in an instant. This is a mainstream historical fact. The religious reforms under Edward VI were far more radical than those under his father, Henry VIII. The first and second books of Common Prayer, for example, were introduced, replacing the Latin Mass with English language services. These books weren't just about making the service more accessible. They were about systematically stripping away the Catholic rituals and beliefs that had been the bedrock of English life for centuries. Edward, for his part, is not a passive figure in this. He is a boy, yes, but he is a boy with a fierce and unyielding sense of purpose. He signs off on every one of these changes with a zeal that is almost unnerving. He attends the sermons of the most radical Protestant preachers, men who rail against the superstitions of the old faith, and who praise the boy king as a new Josiah, a biblical king who cleansed his kingdom of idolatry. Edward, starved for praise and recognition, devours this adoration. He sees himself not as a child, but as a divinely appointed agent of God, a chosen one sent to save his kingdom from eternal damnation. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. Edward, a boy who was raised on a strict diet of Protestant theology, was said to have a particular obsession with the number 7. He would often divide his day into 7 periods of study and prayer, and he would sign his letters with "Your dutiful son in Christ, E7, believing that the number symbolised his divine purpose. It's a small, almost comical detail that reminds you that for all his power and his conviction, he was still just a child, a boy who found a sense of order and purpose in a world that was utterly chaotic. But the ruthless side of the reforms is also on full display. The men who refuse to conform are imprisoned, fined, or worse. The bishops who cling to the old faith are stripped of their titles and sent to the Tower. Even Edward's own sister, the devoutly Catholic Mary, is pressured to conform. She refuses, and the boy king, who had once been close to his sister, now sees her as an obstacle, a symbol of the old ways that must be eliminated. He writes in his journal, with a chilling lack of emotion, about her obstinacy and her unwillingness to embrace the true faith. This brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward was a genuine religious zealot, or if he was simply a puppet, being manipulated by Dudley and the other Protestant leaders. Did he truly believe in the righteousness of his cause? Or was he a boy who was so thoroughly indoctrinated that he couldn't see the harm he was doing? You can watch him, a small, pale figure, signing off on documents that would change the course of English history, and you can see a hint of both. You see a child who has been groomed for this role, who has been taught to believe in a certain way. But you also see a glint of steel in his eye, a sense of purpose and conviction that feels utterly his own. The kingdom is in a state of chaos. The old order is being ripped apart, and the new one is being built on a foundation of fanaticism and ruthlessness. Edward is at the centre of it all, a boy with a divine purpose and a political master who is using that purpose for his own gain. The two are intertwined, a deadly dance of religious fervour and cold-blooded ambition. The boy king is not just a symbol of the new faith, he is its living, breathing embodiment. And as you stand there, watching the churches being stripped of their beauty and their history, you can't help but feel a deep sense of dread. The boy is now a man, but he is a man whose strings are being pulled by a puppet master who will do anything to keep his grip on power. And the boy is about to learn that being a king doesn't mean you have power. It just means you have a target on your back, and that target, as you will soon discover, will be far more vulnerable than anyone could have imagined. You've witnessed the ruthless reforms, the dismantling of the old faith, and the rise of a new fanatical order under the boy king. Edward is now in his early teens, a thin, serious young man, his eyes burning with an almost religious fervour. He's no longer just a pawn, he's a player, a partner in his own destruction. But the foundation upon which this new order is built is as fragile as the boy himself, and now the first cracks are beginning to show. It starts subtly, a quiet complaint, a low fever, a persistent cough. In a world where illness is a constant companion, no one pays much attention at first, but you, standing in the cold, damp halls of the palace, can sense the shift in the atmosphere. The frantic, confident energy of the court begins to give way to a quiet, gnawing anxiety. The king, their glorious, divinely appointed king, is not well. This is a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI's health began to decline noticeably in the spring of 1552. He caught measles and then smallpox, and while he survived them, they left his body weakened and his immune system compromised. But his illness was not just a medical fact, it was a political event. His sickness was a sign, a signal that the time for ambition and scheming was once again at hand. The vultures that had circled his father's deathbed were now circling his, and the man at the centre of the conspiracy is his own master, John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland. He had brought down his rival, Edward Seymour, and he had consolidated his power. But now he has a problem. The king is sick, and he doesn't have a male heir. His nearest relatives are his two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom have been declared illegitimate by Henry VIII's will, but who, under that same will and a later Act of Parliament, were still in the line of succession. Mary, a devout Catholic, is next in line, and for a man who had staked his entire fortune and reputation on the Protestant Reformation, a Catholic monarch is not just an inconvenience, it's a death sentence. Dudley begins to scheme. He knows that if Mary ascends the throne, she will undo all the reforms he has fought for. She will restore the old faith, and she will, almost certainly, have him executed for his part in the destruction of the Catholic Church. He needs a new plan, a way to keep the Protestant faction in power, and to keep his own head on his shoulders. He needs a new queen. This brings up a quirky tidbit. As Edward's health falters, Dudley starts to promote a new idea. The succession should not go to Henry VIII's daughters, but to the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, a young woman named Lady Jane Grey. Why Jane? Because she is a devout Protestant, and perhaps more importantly, because she is married to Dudley's son, Lord Guildford Dudley. It's a bold, almost ludicrous plan. a kind of dynastic power grab so transparent it's almost comical. You can almost see the gears turning in Dudley's mind, a frantic, desperate attempt to secure his power before it's too late. But the plan needs a willing accomplice. It needs the boy king. And Edward, his mind clouded by fever and his body ravaged by illness, is now a perfect target for manipulation. Dudley and his allies begin to whisper in his ear. They tell him that his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, are not legitimate. They tell him that his father's will, which had named them as successors, was against God's law. They tell him that his legacy, the great work of the Reformation, will be undone if he allows a Catholic to take the throne. They appeal to his religious zeal, to his profound sense of purpose. They tell him he has a duty to God to secure the Protestant succession. This is an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward, in his weakened state, was a full-fledged participant in the conspiracy, or if he was simply a puppet being manipulated by Dudley and his allies. Was he a king who was making a last desperate bid to secure his legacy? Or was he a dying boy who was being used by ambitious men? You can look at his private will, the devise for the succession, which he wrote himself and which bypasses his sisters in favour of Lady Jane Grey, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and deeply concerned about the future of his kingdom and his faith, but you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who are preying on his fears and his convictions for their own gain. The seeds of illness have been planted, but the seeds of conspiracy have been planted as well, and as Edward's health begins its slow, inexorable decline, you can feel the tension in the court rise to a fever pitch. The sickness is not just a medical problem, it's a political crisis, and the men who are ruling the kingdom are about to make a desperate and fatal gamble, a gamble that will lead to the downfall of their fortunes and ultimately to a death more horrific than they would ever dare to tell you. You felt the quiet dread that has settled over the court. The nervous energy of men who know their future hangs by a thread as thin as a boy's life. The seeds of conspiracy have been planted, but now the physical decay of the king becomes the central, terrifying fact of the kingdom. The king's body, once the symbol of hope and continuity, is now a symbol of decay and a catalyst for a desperate power grab. It's late winter, and a cold, damp air seems to cling to the stone walls of the palace. Edward's health, which had been a constant concern since childhood, begins its final precipitous decline. The low-grade fevers and persistent coughs he'd always had are now replaced with something far more sinister. A deep, hacking cough racks his thin frame and he struggles for breath. His face, once pale and serious, is now flushed with fever, and his eyes, which had always burned with a fierce intelligence, are now sunken and clouded with pain. You can almost hear his laboured breathing, the raspy whistling sound that fills the room and a chill you can feel in your own chest. This is a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI's final illness was a long, drawn-out affair that lasted for months. The symptoms, as recorded by his physicians and others, point to a terminal case of what was likely tuberculosis. The disease, also known as consumption, would have slowly eaten away at his lungs, leaving him breathless, weak, and racked with a constant debilitating cough. He would have coughed up blood, a gruesome and terrifying symptom that would have left no one in doubt as to the severity of his condition. The court, which had been a hive of activity and intrigue, now becomes a tomb of whispers and hushed conversations. The physicians, a collection of men with beards and grave expressions, are constantly in attendance, but their knowledge is limited, and their remedies are more a product of superstition than of science. They try bleeding him, a common medical practice of the time that, in a patient already weakened by illness, would have only made things worse. They try a variety of herbal remedies, strange concoctions of crushed herbs and animal parts that do nothing to alleviate the symptoms but instead add to his discomfort. You can almost smell the overpowering scent of the herbal poultices and the sickly sweetness of the medicines, a smell of sickness that permeates the very walls of the palace. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. As Edward's health worsened, the physicians, in a state of desperation, began to try more esoteric and bizarre remedies. They reportedly administered to him a concoction of pearls, gold, and other precious stones, ground into a fine powder and mixed with wine. This was a common medieval practice, a belief that the intrinsic value of an object could be translated into a medical cure. It's a ludicrous notion to us, of course, but for them, it was a desperate last-ditch attempt to save a king who was slipping away. It's a horrifying image, a dying boy being forced to swallow the ground-up remnants of his own wealth, a cruel irony that only adds to the tragedy. The illness, which is a physical reality, becomes a political tool. The Duke of Northumberland, his face a mask of feigned concern, uses the king's failing health to push his agenda forward. He claims that the king is so ill that he cannot receive visitors, a convenient excuse to keep the king's sister, Mary, away from his bedside and from any chance of a last-minute reconciliation. He and his allies control access to the king, ensuring that only those who are loyal to their cause are allowed to see him. Edward, in his fevered state, is a prisoner in his own sickbed, a king who is completely and utterly helpless. This is an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward's illness was a natural one, a tragic but common case of tuberculosis, or if it was exacerbated or even caused by a deliberate act of poisoning. Was the pearl and gold concoction a genuine, albeit misguided, attempt to save him, or was it a convenient way to administer something that would hasten his end? You can look at the symptoms, the long, drawn-out decline, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and tragically dying of a terrible disease, but you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who have every reason to want him to die sooner rather than later, men who are using his illness as a tool for their own gain. The young king's body has betrayed him. It has broken down and is now failing him in the most public and humiliating way possible. The sickness is not just a personal tragedy, it is a national crisis. The king is dying, and his death, when it comes, will not be a moment of quiet, peaceful passing. It will be the end of an era, a moment of profound change that will lead to a new, more brutal chapter in the kingdom's history. The king's body is failing him, but his mind, in its fevered state, is about to make one last, fatal decision. A decision that will lead to a death more horrific than they would ever dare to tell you. You felt the chill of the king's sick room, the sense of impending doom that hangs in the air like a shroud. Edward's body, a fragile vessel of a nation's hopes, is failing him, and the men who are supposed to save him are at a loss. The physicians, a collection of the most learned men in the kingdom, are now the main actors in this grim final act. Their presence in the room is a testament to the severity of the illness, and their frantic, desperate ministrations are a masterclass in the medical futility of the Tudor era. Imagine them now, hunched over the king's bed, their faces pale with exhaustion and fear. They are not just treating a boy, they are treating a symbol, a divinely appointed monarch, and their failure will be a political and personal disaster. They have a variety of theories about what is killing the king, and each one is more misguided than the last. They believe the illness is caused by a putrefaction of the lungs, a kind of rotting from within, or a cold humour that is overwhelming the body's natural heat. They don't know about germs or viruses. They believe in the ancient Greek theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and they are convinced that Edward's illness is a result of an imbalance in these humours. Their treatments are a reflection of this flawed understanding. They try bleeding him, a procedure that involves cutting a vein and draining blood from the body, a practice they believe will restore the balance of the humours. You can almost see the small, pale king, his arm bandaged and stained with his own blood, growing weaker with every passing day. They try purging him with powerful laxatives and emetics, believing that they need to cleanse his system of the bad humours. These treatments, of course, would have only added to his dehydration and his weakness. This is a mainstream historical fact. Tudor medicine was a combination of ancient theories, folk remedies, and a good deal of superstition. The treatments were often more harmful than the disease itself, and the mortality rate for even minor illnesses was staggeringly high. For a terminal illness like tuberculosis, their remedies were not just ineffective, they were actively detrimental. The physicians, in their desperation, also turned to more esoteric and bizarre remedies. They try aqua vitae, a kind of distilled alcohol that they believe has magical, life-giving properties. They try administering various herbs and powders, some of which are laced with mercury or other toxic substances, believing that a poison can be used to fight a poison. It's a terrifying image, a dying boy being fed a cocktail of unknown and often deadly substances by the very men who are supposed to save him. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. The doctors, in their daily reports to the council, would often describe the king's condition in incredibly minute and gruesome detail, from the colour and consistency of his phlegm to the odour of his breath. These reports were not just medical documents, they were political missives, meant to show the court that the physicians were doing everything they could and that the king's illness was, in fact, a natural and unavoidable one. It's a fascinating glimpse into a world where even the most intimate details of a person's life were a matter of public and political importance. This is where an open scholarly debate comes in. Historians still argue whether the physicians were simply incompetent, a product of their time and their limited medical knowledge, or if they were complicit in the king's slow, agonising death. Was their treatment a genuine, if misguided, attempt to save him? Or was it a deliberate act of poisoning, a way to hasten his end without the need for a more obvious and more dangerous act of violence? You can look at the symptoms, the long, drawn-out decline, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and tragically dying of a terrible disease, but you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who have every reason to want him to die sooner rather than later, men who are using his illness as a tool for their own gain. The physicians, in their own way, are just as trapped as the king. They are men who are supposed to have all the answers, but they have none. They are men who are supposed to be in control, but they are powerless in the face of a disease they don't understand. Their theories are futile and their remedies are useless. And as you watch them, their faces a mask of professional concern and private terror, you can't help but feel a deep and profound sense of sadness. The king is dying, and the men who are supposed to save him are only making things worse. The boy is about to learn that in a world where power and ambition are everything, even the most learned men can be a part of a conspiracy, and even the most benign actions can be a part of a much darker and much more terrible plan. You've witnessed the slow, agonising decline of the king, the futility of his doctors, and the quiet, gnawing dread that has settled over the court. Edward's body is failing him, and his mind, clouded by fever and a desperate sense of duty, is now a blank canvas for the men who are vying for his power. The peaceful transition of power that Henry VIII had so meticulously planned is now in jeopardy, and the men who rule the kingdom are about to make a desperate and fatal gamble, a bid for the throne that will plunge the country into chaos. At the centre of this desperate bid is John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, the man who had supplanted Edward's uncle and now ruled the kingdom in his name. He is a man who had everything to lose. He had staked his entire fortune and reputation on the Protestant Reformation, and he knew that if the Catholic Mary ascended the throne, she would undo all his work and most likely have him executed. He was a cornered animal, and he was about to lash out. His plan, which had been in the works for months, was audacious, illegal, and completely ruthless. He would convince the dying king to alter the line of succession, to bypass his two half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and to name a new heir. The new heir would be a woman, yes, but a Protestant one, and most importantly a woman who was married to his own son. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and she was a young, brilliant and devout Protestant who was, in Dudley's eyes, the perfect puppet queen. This is a mainstream historical fact. The devise for the succession, a private will written by Edward in his final months, named Lady Jane Grey as his successor and disinherited his two half-sisters. This was a direct violation of Henry VIII's will, which had named Mary and Elizabeth as his heirs, and an act of high treason. The real game, of course, was in convincing the boy king to do it. Dudley and his allies, a cabal of Protestant nobles, began to work on Edward, a boy who was now so sick he could barely sit up in bed. They appealed to his religious zeal, to his profound sense of purpose. They told him that his legacy, the great work of the Reformation, would be undone if he allowed a Catholic to take the throne. They told him that his father's will, which had named Mary and Elizabeth as successors, was a mistake, a political convenience that had no place in a godly kingdom. They told him that he, as a divinely appointed king, had a duty to God to secure the Protestant succession. Edward, for his part, was an easy target. He was a boy who had been raised to believe in his own righteousness, who had been taught that he was an agent of God. He was also a boy who was desperately sick, his mind clouded by fever, and his body racked with pain. He would have been highly suggestible, and he would have been terrified of the thought of his life's work being undone. He was, in a very real way, a captive in his own sickbed, a king who was completely and utterly helpless. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. The king's physicians, who had been treating him for months, suddenly and without explanation left the palace. Their place was taken by an elderly woman, a kind of quack doctor who was known for her strange and often dangerous remedies. Historians still argue whether this was a coincidence, or if she was brought in by Dudley to hasten the king's end. Was she a desperate last-ditch attempt to save him? Or was she an accomplice, a kind of poisoner in disguise? It's a chilling thought, a dying boy being administered to by a strange woman with a secret agenda, but it's one that adds to the pervasive sense of dread and conspiracy that hangs over this final act. This brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward, in his weakened state, was a full-fledged participant in the conspiracy, or if he was simply a puppet being manipulated by Dudley and his allies. Was he a king who was making a last desperate bid to secure his legacy? Or was he a dying boy who was being used by ambitious men? You can look at his private will, the devise for the succession, which he wrote himself and which bypasses his sisters in favour of Lady Jane Grey, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and deeply concerned about the future of his kingdom and his faith, but you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who are preying on his fears and his convictions for their own gain. The desperate bid for the throne has been made. The king has signed the document, and the future of the kingdom is now a question mark. Dudley has made his move, and the game is about to enter its final, most dangerous phase. The boy king is about to learn that being a king doesn't mean you have power. It just means you have a target on your back, and that target, as you will soon discover, will be far more vulnerable than anyone could have imagined. His death, when it comes, will not be a quiet, peaceful passing. It will be the end of an era, a moment of profound change that will lead to a new, more brutal chapter in the kingdom's history. And it will be a death more horrific than they would ever dare to tell you. You've witnessed the desperation, the plotting, and the signing of a document that would change the course of history. The king's private will, the devise for the succession, has been written, bypassing his sisters and naming his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor. It was a desperate act, a last-ditch effort by a dying boy to secure his legacy. But the final act of this tragedy is still to come. The king is dying, and his death, when it comes, will not be a quiet, peaceful passing. It will be the end of an era, a moment of profound change that will lead to a new, more brutal chapter in the kingdom's history. The final days are a blur of fever, pain, and quiet desperation. Edward is now confined to his bed, his body so weak he can barely lift his head. The deep, hacking cough that had been his constant companion is now a continuous rattling struggle for breath. He is coughing up not just blood, but a putrid, foul-smelling substance that stains his sheets and fills the room with a sickening stench. The physicians, who had been his constant companions, have now been replaced by the elderly woman, the quack doctor, whose bizarre remedies do nothing to alleviate his pain. This is a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI's death was a long, drawn-out affair that lasted for months. The symptoms, as recorded by his physicians and others, point to a terminal case of what was likely tuberculosis. The disease, also known as consumption, would have slowly eaten away at his lungs, leaving him breathless, weak, and racked with a constant debilitating cough. He would have coughed up blood, a gruesome and terrifying symptom that would have left no one in doubt as to the severity of his condition. But the final act is not just about the physical decay of the king, it's about his final, most tragic act of will. In a last desperate act to secure the succession, he summoned the Lord Mayor of London, a group of powerful aldermen, and a number of prominent merchants to his sickbed. He spoke to them in a weak, raspy voice, but his message was clear. He had named a new successor, and he expected them to obey his will. He appealed to their religious faith, to their loyalty to the crown, and to their love of the kingdom. It was a final, desperate plea from a boy who was so afraid of what would happen after his death that he was willing to do anything to prevent it. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. As the aldermen stood around his bed, their faces a mixture of fear and pity, Edward, in a moment of lucidity, looked at them and said, "I pray you, do not weep for me. I am going to a better place." It's a heartbreaking image, a dying boy trying to comfort the men who are watching him die. But it's also a testament to his profound religious faith, a faith that had been his constant companion throughout his short and tragic life. He was a boy who truly believed he was going to a better place, a place where he would be free of the pain and the plotting that had been his constant companions. This brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward, in his weakened state, was a full-fledged participant in the conspiracy, or if he was simply a puppet being manipulated by Dudley and his allies. Was he a king who was making a last desperate bid to secure his legacy, Or was he a dying boy who was being used by ambitious men? You can look at his final act, his plea to the alderman, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and deeply concerned about the future of his kingdom and his faith. But you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who are preying on his fears and his convictions for their own gain. The final act of A Dying King is a tragedy, a play with only one actor and no audience. He is alone, surrounded by men who are waiting for him to die, men who are already plotting their next move. He is a boy who is dying, but he is also a king who is making a last desperate bid for power. And his death, when it comes, will not be the end of the story. It will be the beginning of a new one, a story of a kingdom plunged into chaos and a brutal, violent struggle for the throne. The boy who was born to secure a dynasty is now dying, and his death will be the catalyst for its unravelling. And as you stand there watching the final act of A Dying King, you can't help but feel a deep and profound sense of dread. The boy is about to learn that in a world where power and ambition are everything, even the most learned men can be a part of a conspiracy, and even the most benign actions can be a part of a much darker and much more terrible plan. His death will be a horrific one, a death more horrific than they would ever dare to tell you. You've stood by the king's sickbed, a silent witness to his final, desperate act. The device for the succession has been signed, a last-ditch effort to secure his legacy, and the kingdom is holding its breath. The final moments are upon us. The king is dying, and his death will not be the peaceful, quiet passing that the official story would later tell you. It will be a death so horrific, so undignified, and so utterly tragic that it has been a closely guarded secret for centuries. It's the evening of July 6th, 1553. The air in the palace is thick with a sense of dread. The king, who's been clinging to life for months, is now in the final throes of his illness. He's so weak he can barely speak. His breath comes in short, ragged gasps, each one a struggle. The deep, hacking cough that had been his constant companion is now a continuous, rattling struggle for breath. You can almost hear the death rattle, a guttural, terrifying sound that would have sent a chill down the spine of anyone in the room. But the horror is not just in the sound, it is in the sight. The symptoms of tuberculosis in its final stages are gruesome and terrifying. The king would have been covered in open sores and ulcers, a sign of the disease eating away at his body from the inside out. He would have been emaciated, his skin stretched taut over his bones, a living skeleton. And as he coughed, he would have brought up not just blood, but a putrid, foul-smelling substance that stained his sheets and filled the room with a sickening stench. The smell would have been so overpowering that the doctors and courtiers in the room would have had to hold scented handkerchiefs to their faces. This is a mainstream historical fact. The final moments of Edward VI were incredibly undignified and brutal. The official accounts, of course, would later gloss over these details, presenting a more sanitised and peaceful version of his death. But the private letters and journals of those who were there tell a different story. A story of a boy who died a horrible, agonising death, a death that was as brutal as it was tragic. But the most horrific part of all is the final moment. As the king's breath begins to fade, as he slips from life, the men in the room, the men who had been plotting and scheming for months, make a final chilling move. They seal his body in a lead coffin. This isn't a sign of respect. It's a political necessity. They know that once his death is announced, the succession will be in doubt, and they need to keep the body hidden to prevent anyone from seeing the truth of what he had become. They seal him in a coffin that is too small for his body, a coffin that is meant to be a permanent tomb, a place where his body will never be seen again. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. The Duke of Northumberland, in a desperate attempt to show that the king was not poisoned, had his body cut open by a team of physicians to prove that he had died of a natural illness. But the truth is, the physician's report, which was never made public, was vague and inconclusive. The symptoms they described were consistent with tuberculosis, yes, but they were also consistent with a slow-acting poison. The act was meant to be a public declaration of innocence, but it was, in a very real way, a final, chilling violation of the boy's body. This brings up an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the post-mortem was a genuine, if misguided, attempt to prove that the king was not poisoned, or if it was a final, chilling act of desecration, a way to hide the truth of his death. Was the report of the physicians a true and honest one, or was it a document of convenience, a way to cover up a more sinister plot? You can look at the evidence, the conflicting accounts, and the lingering questions, and you can see a hint of both. You see a king who is genuinely and tragically dying of a terrible disease, but you also see a king who is surrounded by men who have every reason to want him to die sooner rather than later, men who are using his illness as a tool for their own gain. His death is not a peaceful one. It is a horrific, undignified, and utterly tragic end to a life that was supposed to be a triumph. He is a boy who was born to secure a dynasty, but who died, alone and in pain, in a coffin that was too small for his body. And as you stand there, a silent witness to his final, most brutal moments, you can't help but feel a deep and profound sense of sadness. The king is dead, and his death will be a closely guarded secret, a horrific truth that they will never tell you. You've witnessed the hidden horror of the king's final moments, the gruesome reality that was sealed away in a lead coffin. But now, the curtain is about to rise on a new, carefully crafted play. The truth of Edward's death is a secret, a horrific reality that the men in power will never let you see. The official narrative, the story they will tell the world, will be a polished, sanitized, and completely fictional account of a peaceful, pious end. It's the morning of July 7th, 1553, the day after the king's death. The news, which had been a quiet, terrible secret for a few hours, is now ready to be announced to the world. But it's not an announcement of grief, it's an announcement of triumph. The official word is that the king died peacefully in his sleep, a pious young man who had accepted his fate and was now in a better place. The Duke of Northumberland, his face a mask of feigned grief, stands before the council and announces the king's passing, but he immediately follows it with the proclamation of the new queen, Lady Jane Grey. The official story is a masterclass in political manipulation. There is no mention of the deep, hacking cough, the putrid discharge, or the emaciated body. There is no mention of the bizarre remedies or the quiet conspiracy. There is only a story of a boy king who, in his final moments, made a courageous and selfless decision to secure the Protestant future of his kingdom. It's a story of a hero, a martyr, a saint. It's a story that is completely and utterly false. This is a mainstream historical fact. The official account of Edward VI's death, as reported in the contemporary chronicles and official documents, was a carefully constructed fiction designed to serve a political purpose. The real, horrifying details were suppressed, and a new narrative was put in their place. But you, who have seen the truth, can see the cracks in the facade. You can see the nervous glances between the nobles, the forced smiles on the faces of the councilmen, and the quiet, almost imperceptible sense of fear that hangs in the air. They are not grieving for a king. They are holding their breath, waiting to see if their desperate gamble will pay off. The new queen, Lady Jane Grey, a young and brilliant woman who was just a pawn in this game, is proclaimed queen. But the proclamation is met with a quiet, almost unsettling silence. The people of London, who had cheered for Edward and his father, are now confused. They had been told that Mary and Elizabeth were next in line for the throne, and they are not convinced by this new, rushed proclamation. They do not know Lady Jane, and they do not trust the men who have put her on the throne. This is where a quirky tidbit comes in. As Lady Jane Grey was being proclaimed queen, a small, unassuming man in the crowd, a butcher by trade, shouted out, "The Lady Mary is the rightful queen." He was immediately arrested and sent to the Tower, but the act of defiance was a sign of what was to come. It was a sign that the official narrative was not working, that the people of England were not going to be so easily fooled. This brings up an open scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether the official narrative was a genuine attempt to provide comfort and stability in a time of great uncertainty, or if it was a cynical, cold-blooded act of propaganda designed to manipulate the public and secure the power of a few ambitious men. Was the story of a peaceful, pious death a loving tribute to a beloved king, or was it a convenient lie to cover up a much darker truth? You can look at the evidence, the official documents, and the private letters, and you can see a hint of both. You see a kingdom that is desperate for a sense of order and continuity, but you also see a group of men who are willing to do anything to get what they want. The official narrative has been set. The story of Edward's peaceful, pious death is now the public truth, and the horrific reality is a closely guarded secret. But the truth, as it always does, will eventually find a way to come out. The people of England will not be so easily fooled, and their loyalty to the rightful heir, the Catholic Mary, will be a force that cannot be contained. The boy who was born to secure a dynasty is now dead, and his death, a horrific secret, is about to lead to a brutal and bloody civil war that will shake the very foundations of the kingdom. The curtain has just risen on the second act of this terrible, tragic play. You've seen the official narrative, the polished lie that the men in power told the world. The king died a peaceful, pious death. But you, a silent witness to the truth, know better. You know the gruesome reality that was sealed away in a lead coffin, a horrific secret that the court would never admit. But secrets, especially those of a dead king, have a way of whispering their way out. And as the kingdom descends into chaos, the whispers begin. The whispers of poison and betrayal. The official story of Edward's peaceful death is not working. The people of England are not fooled. They had been told that Mary and Elizabeth were next in line for the throne, and they are not convinced by this new rushed proclamation. They do not trust the men who have put Lady Jane Grey on the throne, and as the kingdom teeters on the brink of civil war, the whispers about the king's death grow louder. Did he really die of a natural illness? Or was he poisoned? The evidence is all circumstantial, of course, but it's compelling. You can almost hear the hushed conversations in the taverns and the marketplaces, the speculation that runs rampant through the city. They point to the king's rapid decline after the physicians were replaced by the old woman, the quack doctor. They whisper about the strange concoctions he was given, the remedies that seemed to make him worse, not better. They whisper about the Duke of Northumberland, the man who had everything to gain from the king's death. He had orchestrated the entire succession, and he was the only one who truly benefited from it. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rumours of Edward VI's poisoning began almost immediately after his death, and have persisted for centuries. The lack of a clear public explanation for his sudden and rapid decline, combined with the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, led many to believe that he had been murdered. The whispers are not just about poison, they are about betrayal. They whisper about the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, who had been executed by the very men who now rule the kingdom. They whisper about the king's sister, Mary, who had been disinherited and was now a fugitive. They whisper about the boy king himself who had signed away his sister's birthright and who had died alone in agony in a palace surrounded by men who were waiting for him to die. There's a quirky tidbit about this time. A few years after Edward's death, a man named Bartholomew Campion, a Protestant reformer who had been a part of the royal household, was overheard in a London tavern, drunk and remorseful. He reportedly confessed to a group of friends that he had been a part of a plot to poison the king, and that the king had died a slow and agonizing death at the hands of his own physicians. He was immediately arrested and thrown in the Tower, where he was persuaded to recant his confession. But the confession, even if it was a lie, was a sign of the pervasive belief that the king had been murdered. This brings up an open, scholarly debate. Historians still argue whether Edward was a victim of a genuine poisoning plot, or if the rumours were a result of a paranoid and politically charged environment. Was he murdered by the very men who claimed to love him? Or was he a tragic victim of a disease that was as brutal as it was common in the Tudor era? You can look at the evidence, the lack of a clear cause of death, the suspicious circumstances, and the powerful motives, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and tragically dying of a terrible disease, but you also see a boy who is surrounded by men who have every reason to want him to die sooner rather than later. Men who are using his illness as a tool for their own gain. The whispers of poison and betrayal are a powerful force. They are not just rumours, they are a kind of collective memory, a feeling that something is wrong, that the official story is a lie. They are a sign that the kingdom is not ready to accept a new queen who has been put on the throne by a group of men who are willing to do anything to get what they want. They are a sign that the reign of Lady Jane Grey will be a short one. The boy king is dead, and his death, a horrific secret, is about to lead to a brutal and bloody civil war that will shake the very foundations of the kingdom. The whispers of poison and betrayal are a powerful force, and they are about to become a very public and very bloody reality. You've witnessed the final tragic act of the boy king's life, the whispers of poison and betrayal, and the unravelling of a kingdom. The reign of Lady Jane Grey, the puppet queen, is over. Her supporters, including the Duke of Northumberland, have been executed, their desperate gamble for power having failed spectacularly. And on a triumphant wave of popular support, the rightful heir, the devoutly Catholic Mary, takes her place on the throne. The Protestant Reformation, which Edward had fought for so zealously, is now in jeopardy. But the boy king's legacy, the short, tragic reign that had begun with such hope and ended in such horror, is not so easily erased. His legacy is not in the laws he passed, which would all be reversed by his sister. It's not in the churches he helped dismantle, which would all be rebuilt. His legacy is in the questions he left behind, the mysteries that still surround his life and his death. His legacy is in the debate that still rages among historians, a debate about a boy who was supposed to be a triumph, but who instead became a tragedy. One of the most enduring questions is about his character. Was he a child prodigy, a brilliant and pious boy who was genuinely and deeply committed to his faith? Or was he a boy who was so thoroughly indoctrinated by the men around him that he became a living, breathing puppet? Historians still argue about this. You can read his journal, his letters, and his theological treatises, and you can see a hint of both. You see a boy who is genuinely and deeply concerned about the future of his kingdom and his faith. But you also see a boy who is parroting the beliefs of the men who raised him, a boy who has no real sense of self outside of his role as a king and a reformer. His legacy is in this contradiction, in the enigma of a boy who was both a genius and a puppet. Another enduring question is about his death. Was he a victim of a genuine poisoning plot? Or was he a tragic victim of a disease that was as brutal as it was common in the Tudor era? The truth, of course, is somewhere in the middle. The symptoms of his illness, as described by his physicians and others, are consistent with a terminal case of tuberculosis. But the suspicious circumstances, the sudden replacement of his physicians, the administration of strange and often deadly concoctions, and the powerful motives of the men around him all point to a much darker story. His legacy is in this ambiguity, in the lingering suspicion that he was a victim not just of a disease, but of a conspiracy. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. Edward VI's death, regardless of its cause, was a political event of the highest order. It was the catalyst for a power struggle that would have torn the kingdom apart if not for the immense popular support for his sister, Mary. His death, in a very real way, was the end of the Protestant Reformation in England, at least for a few years. His legacy is in the blood that was shed in the civil war that followed his death, in the executions that followed, and in the religious persecution that would mark the reign of his successor. There's a quirky tidbit that adds to the mystery of his legacy. A few years after his death, a man named Bartholomew Campion, a Protestant reformer who had been a part of the royal household, was overheard in a London tavern, drunk and remorseful. He reportedly confessed to a group of friends that he had been a part of a plot to poison the king, and that the king had died a slow and agonising death at the hands of his own physicians. He was immediately arrested and thrown in the Tower, where he was persuaded to recant his confession. But the confession, even if it was a lie, was a sign of the pervasive belief that the king had been murdered. His legacy is in this rumour, in this whisper that will never be completely silenced. His legacy is also in his sister's actions. Mary I, a woman who had been declared a bastard and had been persecuted for her faith, now had a chance for revenge. She would reverse all of Edward's religious reforms, she would restore the Catholic Church, and she would execute hundreds of Protestant reformers, earning her the lasting nickname of Bloody Mary. Edward's legacy is in her reign, in the brutal and bloody reversal of all that he had fought for. It is a legacy of failure, a legacy of a boy who tried to change the world, but who instead left it in a state of chaos and bloodshed. But for all of his tragic mistakes, for all of his misguided beliefs, you can't help but feel a profound sense of pity for the boy. He was a child who was born into a world of immense expectation and suffocating paranoia. He was a boy who was used and manipulated by the very men who claimed to love him. He was a king who was a prisoner in his own sickbed. His legacy is not in the political and religious chaos that followed his death. It is in the tragedy of his life, a life that was supposed to be a triumph, but which instead became a testament to the brutality of power and the fragility of life. So now, as we close this chapter, you can see the full picture. The boy who was born to secure a dynasty, the boy who was raised to be a saint, the boy who died a horrific, undignified death, is now just a footnote in a history book. But for us, the silent witnesses to his final, most brutal moments, he is a tragic hero, a boy whose life and death will forever be a mystery, a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in an enigma. His legacy is in the whispers of poison and betrayal, in the brutal and bloody reign of his sister, and in the enduring questions that still surround his life and his death. Now, let's ease out of this dark place and back into the quiet of your room. The echoes of the bells and the whispers of the court are fading now. The images of a frail boy, a brutal death, and a kingdom in chaos are softening, becoming a part of the long, strange tapestry of history. The secrets of the Tudors are just that, secrets, and they can't reach you here, safe in your bed. Let the silence of the night fall around you, a gentle blanket of peace after the storm of our story. You are safe, you are warm, you are right where you're supposed to be.